Welcome back to the Master Your Money podcast with me, Marini Jackson, your guide to mastering credit, building wealth, and creating financial freedom. Let's dive into today's episode. So today I have a special podcast, and this is to it made me think a lot because I recently had a dear former colleague of mine who passed away, or some people like to say that this person transitioned. And for me, when I hear people transitioning, I just always think back of conversations, the good times that I will definitely remember um, the person for. And it was no different for this particular person. His name was Marshall, and he basically, a few years ago, trained me to be his replacement. I had no clue that I'd be, after he left, doing basically everything he did. So I'm gonna call this money lessons from Marshall, and all of these things were not necessarily taught. A lot of it was caught. And Marshall, let me give you a little background about him. What he shared, about his finances. He didn't share salary or anything like that. That was not legal with my employer. But he was in his 60s. He was a military veteran. He was a proud Marine, and he also retired from another company. And this was his third company that he was working with, that he would be getting retirement. He also had the pension with this company. So he was in his, definitely the sunsetting of his, professional career. And I don't remember how old I was, but I was not. I had decades more to work. And the young idealistic person and this older person. So interesting dynamic. But some things Marshall told me about himself, about his family, things like that. Um, he mentioned, he's like, you know, my house is paid off. My wife and my he said these things. My wife's car is paid off. My car is paid off. My two children, they're adults. They are living on their own, and they don't have to depend on me financially. And I was like, okay, well, that's cool. But it gets deeper and it gets better. I'll say that. So definitely, you know, tap into this episode. So one of the things, that Marshall did, he was the credit card administrator for one of the corporate card programs that the employer used. And for this card provider, there's major card providers like Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, etc. He was like, "Oh, I have this card, this same card as my that's my personal credit card with this provider." And he was saying, "You know what? Whenever I make a purchase, my wife, before I even get home, she knows exactly what I bought." And that's because he had alerts. So tip number one is he had spending alerts set up for his account. And I'm not sure if you can do this for your bank accounts. You most likely can. If you aren't sure, contact your bank. But your credit card provider, you can get those alerts on when you've made purchases. And apparently he and his wife, that is something that he was very transparent about. So lesson number two, be transparent with your spouse about your spending. And he would say, his wife would be like, "What did you buy from Home Depot now?" And they just he just made light of it. But two great lessons. Sign up for those alerts, and also be transparent about your spending. lesson number 3 that I learned from Marshall, and this is at a time I really wasn't, you know, extremely knowledgeable about credit scores, but he was saying, he's like, oh, well, my credit score is this. And he wasn't brag, he was just stating a fact. But he would say, well, my wife's credit score is this, and sometimes my score is higher than her score. So they, made it a friendly competition. So lesson number 4 would be know your credit score, and number 4A, I'll say that, is, with your spouse, make sure they know their score. And if you want to keep a friendly competition going as you're, building or maintaining your credit scores, then it can just make finances fun and not grievous. Um, lesson number 5 from Marshall. As I said, he was a veteran. He also was in his 60s, and we worked for a particular local employer. And sometimes I didn't go out to lunch a lot, period. Like, I still maintain the let me pack my breakfast, lunch, snacks. um, a lot of times I'll have car snacks, even like if traffic is bad, so I don't get hangry. But that's just me, my personal strategy with that. But at Marshall, he would go out for breakfast, and that going out usually meant going to the cafeteria. And then lunch, he'd either eat in the cafeteria or like go, off site from the company and at a local restaurant and grab some lunch. And a few times, sometimes he would say, "Hey, you want to come with me to lunch?" And sometimes I'd say no. The times I've said yes, he would try to use every benefit he had. Um, and I'm not saying that in a bad way or that he was being cheap, because I do the same thing now too. First, he'd start with our employer. He's like, "Hey, do you have a discount for the employer?" Because we both have our badges on, of course. If they're like, "No, we don't," then do you have a military discount or a veteran discount? Do you have a AAA discount? Do you have a senior discount? Do you have AARP discount? And sometimes we go places and the answer to all those questions was no. But they're like, you know what? Because I'm gonna give you 10% off just because. Sometimes that would happen, but that 10% can definitely add up if you go different places. So use whatever benefit you have. As I mentioned, veterans, employer, different organizations, things of that nature. You can most likely at a lot of places get discounted rates because of who you are, what you've done, things of that nature. Another thing, I mentioned that he retired from the military and another company, and was looking to retire from our employer. He would check his retirement balances, and he did it. The I'm trying to think of how to say it. The 401k administrator for our employer, I would see him log into that site. I of course didn't look to see balances, but he would check that on a regular basis just to see where he was financially. So number 6 would be start saving for retirement. Check your balances, see where you are compared to your timeline. And I would say 5 or 6, I can't remember which number we're on. Definitely invest and have conversations, especially if there is an employer match. If it's like a 401k, your employer is matching a certain dollar amount. I know different people will give you different advice about whether or not to get a 401k, but if you are with an employer that does offer some type of retirement benefit and they're giving you a company match, invest, get that free money to be added to your your retirement account, and have those conversations with your advisor, um, no matter where you are in that work and retirement horizon. And one thing Marshall told me, this would be, I think, 5B C, is he mentioned investing 10%. Like most people would stop at whatever the company match is, but, and I think ours was like maybe 6%, maybe. But whatever that match is, definitely get there if you can. But then when he said, hey, I told my son to do this, invest 10%. And I did every year, I would sit down and when it was time for the annual enrollment, write out this is my annual pay, this is the contributions that will be, the funds that will be taken out of my pay every pay period. And when I did the 10%, it was just as he said. He said he told his son, invest 10% and it will feel like you had an increase in pay. I'm not sure what happens at if mathematically at that number for our particular plan, but I did notice, like, yes, I was giving more, but I also was receiving more of my paycheck. So if anyone is in that industry and you may be listening, definitely feel free to share some insight about that. And I definitely know with um, our employer, they would really strongly recommend people to invest 15%. Now, Marshall, being that he was close to his horizon, he invested more than that, so that he can put that in his 401k, and that would go towards his retirement. And I'll say this number 6, I believe it's number 6. Make sure you're paying things off. Now, again, like I said, Marshall, he's like, my house is paid off. Wife and his cars were paid off. Whatever. He still used credit cards and paid that off every month. But make sure you're paying off your debts. Um, don't keep debt around for a long time, but make it a plan, make it a strategy to pay those things off so that you have that freedom, that wiggle room. And when you're in retirement, where you may have a different amount of income every month, then you're not struggling to pay or stressed to pay a particular debt. And I will say 3 other lessons. So number 7 is, I'll say this, Marshall was involved in a lot of community organizations, things of that nature. He would, ask for volunteer. I would hear him on the phone, asking like, hey, can you volunteer to do this? Sometimes those things fell through and he would have to pay, make bear more of the financial brunt. But one thing I have had seen him do as well is he would ask others for help. So ask for help if you're in like volunteer organizations, and those who could, they definitely said yes. So that way you're not paying for everything yourself. Also, Marshall was a giver. He was very generous. He, when he would, take people to lunch, because it wasn't just me, but others he would go to lunch with, sometimes he'd pick up the tab for those people. He would bring, treats into work. I live in the South. We have Krispy Kreme, and he would pass by the Krispy Kreme every work day, and sometimes he'd bring like boxes in of just donuts. So he was, a giver. Like I'm sure planned it. And the final lesson I would say is expect the unexpected and be prepared. And I'll preface that with, being laid off with a smile. Now, the industry that we worked together in is a very cyclical industry, meaning some years things, are, great, sales are great, and then other years, sales may be lower, production may not be as high, and the company, of course, their ultimate goal is to be profitable, and that unfortunately means they have to let go some employees, they have to lay them off or do what they call a reduction in force. And I've can't remember exact number I've personally witnessed, but I have witnessed, you know, some former colleagues around me, um, essentially being laid off, and we'd all know who it was because we'd hear the little paper bags opening and them collecting, and they only gave them one. Some people had been there a really long time and had a lot of stuff, so not sure what they did about that, but hear the bag opening and people, it would just be like a dead silence as that person's packing their things up to leave. And um, Marshall, he was let go. And I can't remember how long, but a few weeks after he left the company, he called me and, he was just, let me know, everything's fine. And he was like, oh, when I left, I was smiling, I was cracking jokes. And, unfortunately, that's not everyone's experience. But I will, let this be the last money lesson. And I say that because we never know what's going to happen. And this is why all of the previous money lessons, and I do have a bonus, all of the other previous money lessons that I've mentioned that I've learned just by, observation, mostly observation, and just, working together. But how many of us can say if our main income source was, eliminated in a blink of an eye, that we can still be fine financially? And that's the point that, as a financial coach, that I want to ensure that, you know my clients get to. That's what I advocate for. That you don't have to make permanent decisions over temporary situations, that you can have some breathing room, that you don't have to immediately like sell your house or have such financial turmoil because employment ended with one company. And he, basically told me, I made more, made some good decisions, and that's why I'm able to still be happy, still have a smile on my face, still speak well of the company. And unfortunately, that's not everyone's story. So I definitely want to say, anytime I'm sharing about anything with managing your finances, things like this are the reason why. And the bonus tip I wanted to give, I'm just going to circle back quickly about Marshall. He said he had adult children. They were not, basically weren't in his pockets necessarily. They could stand on their own. And that came from having boundaries. He did tell me that with his children, he told them, or he and his wife, he's like, hey, the Tuck Family Scholarship, meaning that mom and dad, who are this funding this scholarship, they pay for their children's undergraduate education, I guess up to a certain dollar amount, and beyond any type of advanced education, then their children would be responsible for that. And what a legacy, I will say, that could be left, that you can several jobs, and make some great financial decisions, support your children to pay for their college education, pay off your home, make sure you and your wife's vehicles are paid off. And when he passed away and his wife notified me, I asked, like, is there anything I can do? And she's like, no, I'm fine. Thank you for being his friend. So um, definitely I learned a lot, about work as well, but about life, just from interacting, listening, and just absorbing things from my former colleague Marshall. So I hope that there were some nuggets that stood out for you as well. But I wanted to thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Master Your Money podcast. And if today's episode helped you, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a new lesson on mastering your money. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a review and share this podcast with a friend who's ready to build financial freedom too. And if you're ready to take the next step, visit me at www.virtuefinancialsolutions.org to learn more about my coaching program, workshops, and resources to help you on your financial journey. So until next time, remember, you don't just manage your money, you master it.